The Mike Stubbs Show. Newstalk 1290. CJBK.
Had a conversation yesterday. Excuse me. I did get a text in. We were talking just a little while ago about 50 Shades of Grey. And 50 Shades of Grey, from the perspective of Lindsay Barnett, who is a female, who's read this, a young female, doesn't like that it is being likened at all to domestic violence. Texter texting in saying, I've heard Megan Walker on the radio so many times, and to me it sounds like Megan is flying up in the sky way overboard. She can say whatever she wants about the 50 Shades book. The people that want to go see the movie will still go for it. Jake. Thank you, Jake, for that text. And that was kind of the point that we were trying to make, is not that we glorify domestic violence by any stretch of the imagination. No. That having been said, we do have to be very careful with what we define as glorifying or creating part of that rape culture. And that's where Lindsay Barnett, I thought, did a wonderful job of just explaining that that's not the case. We're akin to, but in a different vein. Yesterday had on a lady named Brianna Wu, who in the Huffington Post wrote a blog that introduced me, I had never heard this term before, to Gamergate. The term Gamergate I had never heard of before. It was in a Law and Order episode going back last week, or earlier this week, excuse me. She talks about death threats, threats of rape, the misogynistic atmosphere as she, a game developer, tries to move forward in an industry that is so misogynistic and sexist it keeps her back. An excerpt quickly from her piece says, when Twitter is completely ineffectual at handling harassment, it's because women don't truly have a seat at the table running it. When Wikipedia's highest ruling board chooses to discipline only feminists, it's because 9 out of 10 of the editors are men. Amazingly, the field of video games is the most misogynistic area of all of tech. Ubisoft's hit franchise Watch Dogs angrily denied that Gamergate was a hate group, calling such statements as smear tactic and obvious lie. We got texts and tweets in this saying, well, wait a second, that's not the right angle. You got to move away from this angle. And apparently there is a book in the process of being written, and that person writing that book is over in another London, or at least in the London area, Milo Yiannopoulos. And he joins us now. Milo, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it, sir.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
You heard me kind of synopsizing some of the things that Brianna was talking about. And maybe just help me out. Do you disagree with what she's saying? Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, obviously, Brianna is one of the major figures, whether we like it or not, in this debate. She's famous only for one thing, which is advertising threats that she says that she's received. Now, the problem is that as a reporter, rather than simply uncritically repeat these allegations, as so many of the gaming blogs have done, our job is to look into these things to work out exactly what happened and when it happened and the nature of the threats and all the rest of it. As more reporters do that, we start to realize that Brianna's narrative is not quite what it appears at first. And I published an article today which explained that some of the biographical details about Brianna's past, which we don't need to go into on air, suggest that a degree of skepticism might be warranted. But I'd like to sort of zoom out slightly before we get into the discussion properly and just explain that her characterization of Gamergate is not the one that any member of the movement would recognize. Okay,
well, maybe let's begin right there, because I have never heard of Gamergate. I didn't know what this was. So maybe let's focus exclusively on the definition first and foremost. What is Gamergate?
Well, the high-level way to understand it is that the culture wars have finally made it to video games. We've seen it happen in literature, music, art, movies, fantasy, sci-fi, comic books. And in all of these arenas, we've seen a sort of congealing of two sides of commentators who like to talk around the art. We've seen, on the one hand, let's call them sort of coastal hipster bloggers from places like Vox and Gawker, and feminist activists who tend to take the view that some of these art forms are dangerous and can affect us as sort of misogynistic and violent, very much like old sort of the religious right used to. And people who are now creating moral panics tend to be on the left. And on the other side of these debates are sort of ordinary men and women who just want to get on with their hobby and don't care too much about politics. Now, Gamergate has split, like other fandoms, it's come a little bit later to video games, but it has split in the same way. So it's first and foremost an explanation that it means that the culture wars have finally come to video games. And the Gamergate movement, specifically and in particular, is a reaction from gamers, from ordinary video game players, against two things. One of them is the notoriously shoddy standards in the video games press. And the second is sort of wacky, way-out kind of feminist critiques of video games, which suggest that video games can make people misogynistic or can in some way contribute to an atmosphere of misogyny. The video games industry did a really good job of batting away criticism that video games make you violent. And the games press, too, did a reasonably good job of explaining that there is no science, or at a bare minimum the science is certainly, the jury's out, if you like, as to whether video games can make you any more or less violent. Now they've decided to throw what they learned from that out of the window when feminist critics come along and say, well, okay, video games might not make you violent, but they can make you sexist. Gamers don't believe this. They just want to be left alone to enjoy their hobby, and they have been assaulted by very well-funded, well-organized feminist campaigners, and unfortunately the vast majority of the games press, which seems to have bought into this idea that ordinary video games are in some way socially harmful.
This may be an unfair question to ask you as we speak with Milo Yiannopoulos, and as we speak, he's in the process of writing a book about Gamergate, which is essentially, I like what you described it as, the gender war coming to the video game development world and the video game world in general. And I don't know if this is fair to ask you this question, so I apologize if I catch you off track with it. But I mean, I'm not an avid gamer, but I have played video games before in the internet world. The minute that it is sniffed out that there is a girl on as an avatar playing, the ridicule comes in, and it is mean, it is nasty, it is completely not the way that a male player is treated. Is that maybe what is overtaking what the actual argument of Gamergate actually is?
Well, I think you could have a discussion. It would be a different discussion. It wouldn't necessarily be strictly pertinent to Gamergate about whether certain communities, based around certain games, under certain conditions, tend to be very male-dominated. Now, we're very comfortable in society giving, as indeed we should be, providing women with safe spaces for women to go to speak about women's issues. You know, we have sort of female gender-specific groups and clubs and membership organizations and foundations and all sorts of things. We're a little bit more reticent about encouraging men to do the same thing. The reality is, hardcore gaming is an overwhelmingly male pursuit. The vast majority of people who play a lot of video games all the time, and people who play the sorts of video games which are commonly characterized as more sexualized, more violent, containing more guns, the sort of boobs and bombs games, overwhelmingly male. Now, I would characterize, from what I've seen, reporting on this for the last 6 months, the sort of overexcitement that happens when it's revealed that finally a woman has walked into the arena of battle or into the playpen. I would characterize it more as a sort of what they call on the internet sort of dropping spaghetti. People just sort of freak out that there's a woman there at all. I don't think it's the case that people sort of hurl misogynistic violence at anybody at the slightest whiff of a female username. I think it's just that these guys aren't used to seeing women around a lot, and a lot of them, of course, let's remember, are teenagers. So it's unfair, I think, to say that. And I also think that if there were some validity in some games, on some platforms, under some circumstances, being very male-dominated, I don't think it's hugely pertinent to Gamergate, particularly because so many Gamergate supporters are themselves female and are of various ethnicities, are of various sexualities. It's a very broad church, and what that reminds us is the movement isn't really about identity politics and men versus women and that sort of thing. What the movement's about is press ethics, and the movement is rejecting feminist critiques of video games and standing up to video game bloggers who post articles saying gaming is dead and video gamers are dead because of this culture war rift, where the journalists who write about video games don't really understand the people who play them, and don't really like the people who play them. They tend to sneer at them a little bit. They look down their noses at them. And that rift is what's responsible for the sort of loss of communication here. I don't think it's a war of the sexes issue, so much as a misunderstanding of what's actually being discussed. We talk about Gamergate, we're talking about press ethics, and we're talking about a rejection of wacky feminist critiques.